6 days after my wife's funeral, my daughter-in-law stood in the middle of the kitchen I had spent nearly half my life protecting, and calmly told me it was time for me to find somewhere more suitable to live. My son stood behind her, hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the floor, the very same wooden floor where, as a little boy, he used to cling to my legs while learning how to walk. He wouldn't look at me, wouldn't object, couldn't even say a single word to ask me to stay. I answered with only one word, "All right." That was all. And in that moment I caught the brief flash of disappointment crossing her face. Because she had prepared herself for a fight, and I refused to give her one. Instead, I quietly tightened my grip around the small brass key inside my coat pocket, the one my wife had slipped into my hand 3 weeks before she died, whispering, "Don't tell anyone." They thought I had nothing left. That was the biggest mistake they ever made. My name is Arthur Pell. I'm 69, and for 34 years I drove buses out of a depot in Leeds before Margaret and I came south to be near our boy. I want to tell you about the woman who put me out of my home, and I want to do it fairly, because the easy thing would be to make her a monster, and I've decided I'm too old to lie to make myself comfortable. Her name was Saskia, and the thing about Saskia is that she genuinely believed she was the only sensible person in any room. That's what made her what she was. Not cruelty, she'd have been wounded to be called cruel. Certainty. She had built, over the 7 years she'd been married to my son, a version of the world in which she was the practical one, surrounded by sentimental old fools who'd never managed money properly. And a story like that, told to yourself enough times, lets you do almost anything and call it common sense. So I'll say this before I go further. If you've ever stood in a room you built with your own hands and watched someone half your age decide it was theirs to dispose of, then you already know the silence I mean. It doesn't shout. It just settles on you like sawdust. Let me go back. Margaret died on a Wednesday. Her heart, quick and quiet, in the garden she loved, among the tomatoes she'd never let me touch because I drowned them. By the following Tuesday I was being moved out of our house by my son's wife, and my son was standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets looking at the floor. His name is Daniel. He's 38. He couldn't look at me through the whole funeral, and he couldn't look at me when Saskia said it was time I went somewhere more manageable, and I'll tell you the truth, that was the part that took the wind out of me. Not her, him. Because I remember a different boy. I remember a boy who waited at the front window every evening for the sound of my bus pulling up at the end of the road, who'd run down the path in his socks. I remember teaching him to plane a piece of wood in the shed, his small hands over mine on the tool, both of us covered in shavings, Margaret calling us in for tea, and neither of us wanting to come. I put that boy through college on a bus driver's wage, and never once made him feel the cost of it. I'd do it again tomorrow. And then he met Saskia, and over 7 years I watched him hand himself across to her an inch at a time. Not because she forced him, because she was sure of everything, and Daniel had never in his life been sure of anything, and certainty is a powerful thing to marry into. She decided where they lived and who they saw and what was reasonable, and my agreeable boy agreed, because being agreeable was the thing he'd always been praised for. So when she told me to go, and he stared at the carpet, I wasn't only angry. I was grieving twice over, Margaret in the ground, and the boy from the shed somewhere lost inside the man in the doorway. Here's what Saskia didn't know. 3 weeks before she died, and I didn't understand it then, I thought she was just being Margaret. Fussing my wife had sat me down at the kitchen table and put a key in my hand. Brass, worn, a number stamped in it. She closed my fingers over it. "If anything happens to me before you, Arthur," she said, "you go to the bank on King Street. You take this. You don't tell Daniel. You don't tell that wife of his. Promise me." I'd laughed at her. "Nothing's going to happen to you, you daft thing. You'll bury me and dance on the grave." "Promise me," she said again, and she didn't laugh. "Say it back." "I won't tell anyone." "Good." And she'd patted my hand and gone back to the tomatoes, and I'd forgotten about the key, more or less, until the morning Saskia told me to pack a bag, and I felt it through the lining of my coat and closed my fist around it, and something in me that had been lying flat for a week stood up. She doesn't know, I thought. Whatever this is, she doesn't know. Now I have to tell you something about Margaret and money, because it's the heart of all this. My wife handled our money for 43 years. I never asked. I drove the bus, I brought home the wage, and she made it stretch, and disappear, and stretch again. And when she said we can't afford that, Arthur, I believed her, and when she said we'll manage, I believed that too. I thought I was being a good husband, trusting her. The truth is I was hiding. Numbers frightened me, always had, since I was a boy who couldn't make sense of them at school. And Margaret knew it, and she let me hide behind her my whole life. I didn't understand what that meant until I sat across a desk from a solicitor I'd never met. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I packed a small case. 2 jumpers, my good boots, the photograph of Margaret and me on Scarborough Beach in 1978, and her tomato seeds in their little paper envelopes, because I couldn't leave them in a house that was no longer mine. On the table, Saskia had laid out papers with a yellow note sign, here, 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 a transfer of the house to Daniel. I signed every page. My hand was steady. People think that was me giving up. It wasn't. It was me being patient, and there's a difference almost nobody knows. Because 2 days earlier, a text had come from a blocked number. Mr. Pell, do not sign anything until we speak. F. Adebayo. I'd nearly deleted it as a scam, but the name stuck, because Margaret had mentioned it once or twice over the years. Mr. Adebayo, her solicitor, the man Saskia had told me was retired now. We used someone simpler, so when I signed those papers I knew something they didn't. I knew the house might not be the only thing on the table, and I let them have it, because a man playing a long game lets you take the piece he doesn't need. I walked out with my case in one hand. My neighbor Mr. Okafor was out with his bins and raised a hand to me, and I raised one back, and I didn't cry, and I didn't look at the house. I checked into a transport cafe's rooms above the bar, the sort of place lorry drivers use. 45 pounds cash, a narrow bed, a radiator that ticked all night, a window over the car park. I sat on the edge of that bed, and I'll tell you exactly what I felt, because you've earned the truth. I felt awake. For the first time since Margaret died, properly awake. Then I rang Mr. Adebayo. He answered on the 3rd ring, and when I gave my name there was a long breath, and then, Mr. Pell, I've been hoping you'd call. Can you come to my office in the morning? 9 o'clock. Tell nobody. A pause. And bring the key. I want to stop here, because something happened that night I almost left out. I lay in that little room and I thought, I could ring Daniel right now. I could tell him there's a key, a solicitor, something his mother left. I could make him choose, tonight, and I didn't. Not to punish him, I want to be clear about that. Because I needed to know who my son was, when there was nothing to be gained by being good. You can't find that out by handing a man a reason. You can only find it out by watching, and watching is a slow, cold business, and it costs you. And honestly, if you'd asked me whether I had the nerve for it, I'd have said no. I think a braver man would have wrung his son that night and risked it. I think part of what I called patience was a coward's way of not having to hear Daniel choose her to my face. I've made my peace with that, mostly. Mr. Adebayo's office was above a laundrette. He was a careful man, glasses pushed up into gray hair, and he turned the key in his fingers and nodded slowly. Do you know what this opens, Mr. Pell? A box. At the bank. That's all she told me. He opened a folder thick as a brick. I acted for your wife for 29 years. Most of that time, your wife alone at her instruction. She was a careful woman. Careful. And, I'll be honest with you, very private. She didn't want certain people to understand the size of what she'd put together. Certain people, I said. You mean Saskia? I mean, he said gently, anyone who might bleed your son dry through your son. Her words. Not mine. Then he slid a single sheet across the desk, and I read it. And the room went strange and still, the way a room goes when everything you thought you knew about your own life turns over in front of you. I won't tell you the figure. It doesn't matter, and it was never the point. I'll tell you it was more than I'd earned in 34 years of driving, many times over. Margaret had inherited a share of her brother's printing business in 2004 when he passed, and instead of spending it, she'd invested it, quietly, patiently, year after year, while she told me we couldn't afford a new car and made do and mended. There was a flat in the city she'd bought outright 6 years ago and never mentioned. All of it in a trust that named me, and only me. We'd driven a 12-year-old Astra. She'd darned my socks. She'd told me we'd manage. Why, I said, and my voice came out wrong. Why didn't she tell me? His face softened. She told me you'd wave her off, that you couldn't bear to look at money, that it frightened you, and she didn't want to frighten you. So she carried it for you. She told me her one fear was that if your son's wife ever learned the truth, she'd take it, and your son with it, and you'd be left with nothing because you'd never once in your life thought to look after yourself. And the worst of it, the thing that put a fist in my throat right there above the launderette, was that she was right. 43 years I'd let her carry it. I'd called it trust. It was hiding, and she'd loved me enough to let me. And now she was gone, and I was finding out the shape of my own life from a stranger. If you've ever discovered, far too late, that someone spent years protecting you in a way you never thanked them for because you never even knew, then you understand why I had to sit very still and breathe. The box held papers, a memory stick, and a letter in her round, impatient hand. I won't read you all of it. Some of it is only mine. But she wrote that she was sorry, that she'd been afraid I'd think she didn't trust me, and afraid of the fight she knew would come once she was gone. She wrote that she'd bought the flat because she wanted us to have one place with no past in it, no years of going without, somewhere we could be two daft pensioners starting again. She'd meant to take me there on our 40th anniversary, and tell me we were free now. I always thought I'd have more time, Arthur, she wrote. Don't let them make you small. You were never small. You just let me be the big one. Be brave now. Be free. I sat in the cold of that bank and cried like I hadn't since I was a boy. Be free. She'd underlined it. Now I'll tell you what I did with it, and I'll be careful, because this is where these stories usually turn into a fairy tale of revenge, and life isn't that tidy. I didn't go to the flat, not for weeks. Walking into all that space while Margaret was 3 weeks in the ground felt like a betrayal. I stayed above the cafe. I read everything in the box. I learned my own life backwards. And I let Saskia believe she'd won, because Mr. Adebayo told me the most useful thing anyone had said to me in years. Let her think it's finished. People who think they've won stop being careful. She wasn't careful. Within a fortnight she'd texted demanding Margaret's mother's brooch family property, she called it. I said no. She threatened solicitors. I said nothing. Then Daniel rang. Small voice. He'd been made redundant. Saskia was panicking. Could I help them out, just to bridge a gap? I thought of every time I'd said yes. The deposit on their car. The loan that never came back. The student debt I'd quietly cleared and never mentioned. No, I said. And saying no to my own boy was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than the funeral. Every bone in me was built to say yes to that lad. I had to grip the edge of the bed. Dad, you don't understand. We're in real trouble. You made your choice, son, I said. You stood in that doorway and said nothing while she put me out 6 days after we buried your mother. I'll always be your father. But I'm not your safety net while you're still hers. I hung up before he could hear my voice go. What I did next, I did slowly, legally, quietly, through Mr. Adebayo, through a company that led nowhere near me. I didn't burn anything down. The block of flats where Daniel and Saskia rented had a landlord trying to sell for months. I bought the building. And when the new owners restructured the tenancies cold, businesslike, exactly the sort of phrase Saskia herself used a notice to vacate arrived. Professional. Signed by a manager I never met. She rang me screaming, certain it was me. I told her, truthfully, that I lived above a transport cafe and owned no buildings. It's public record, I said. Look it up. And of course it led nowhere. Was that cruel? I've turned it over a great many nights. I think it was. I wanted her, just once, to feel the exact thing she'd made me feel told to leave a home with nowhere certain to go. I'm not going to pretend to you I'm above wanting that. I drove a bus for 34 years and stayed patient through every kind of person, and underneath I'm still a man who can want someone to suffer. I'd rather tell you that straight than have you think I floated above it like a saint. I didn't float above anything. I had the means, for once, and I used them. But here's the line I drew, and it's the only part of this I'm truly proud of. When Daniel turned up above the cafe, unshaven, gray, in the same suit he'd worn to bury his mother, and found me rinsing my socks in the sink because I wouldn't pay the bar's laundry prices, his face came apart. He'd believed all those weeks that I had savings, a comfortable little flat. Saskia had told him so, and he'd let himself believe it because believing it was easier. You've been here, he said, all this time. I let him sit in it. Then he told me Saskia was pregnant. 2 months. She'd shown him the test. If he didn't sort out somewhere to live, she'd go and take the baby. I felt the old pull the grandfather in me, instant and fierce. And then I felt something colder, because I'd watched that woman for 7 years. "Daniel," I said, "when did she last let you come to a doctor's appointment with her?" He went quiet. "When she said it was private. Her body." He stared at me. "I'm not proud of how I found out. I paid someone. A blood test at a real clinic, arranged on a pretext, and it came back 0. No pregnancy. Never had been. She'd bought herself time the only way she knew, by reaching for the one thing that would chain my son to her. When I told him, he didn't shout. He made a sound I'd never heard a grown man make, and he said, 'I chose her over you,' and she was lying the whole time. I didn't say I told you so. I want you to hear that. There's a version of me that had earned the right. I didn't take it. I sat on that narrow bed and held my son the way I'd held him during thunderstorms 40 years before, both of us too big for it, and I understood that being right is worth nothing next to that. So here's what the whole thing taught me, and I've worn it smooth, turning it over at night. The mistake most of us make is thinking love means saying yes. I made it with Daniel for 38 years. I said yes until he never had to become anyone. What I finally understood is that the kindest thing I ever did for my boy was put him in a room with no money in it, no wife pulling the strings, no father fixing it, and let him find out who he was. He rents a small place near me now. He has a job he's not too proud for. He comes on Sundays and we don't talk about money, because he's never asked. And the fact he's never asked is the most hopeful thing about him. We planted Margaret's tomatoes in pots on his windowsill. He drowns them, same as I used to. She'd have laughed. If you take one thing from an old man's story, take this. Look at the part of your own life you've been waving off because the numbers frighten you, or because someone else has always carried it, and open it. Read it. Don't let love be the reason you stay in the dark, and don't let it be the reason you keep someone else there. Margaret loved me, and she kept me in the dark to spare me, and even love can't make that anything but a cage with the door painted to look like a wall. And then sit with this a moment before you go. Who have you been protecting from the truth, or who's been protecting you because the truth felt too heavy to carry together? I don't know what you'd have done that morning, with my dead wife's ring against my chest and my son staring at the floor. Maybe you'd have fought. Maybe you'd have crumbled. Maybe you'd have been wiser than me and never let it get that far. So tell me, if you think Arthur was right to stay quiet and wait, comment 1. If you think he should have fought back the moment they told him to go, comment 2. And if you think he went too far, if buying that building crossed a line, comment 3. I mean it, I want to know, because I'm still not certain myself. And tell me where you're watching from, and what the time is there right now. If you've ever stood in a room where someone looks straight through you as if you weren't there, I'd like to hear about it if you want to tell me. If this one stayed with you, even a little, you might think about subscribing. Not for me, because there are more of these, and the people who find them tend to be the people who needed them. I'm glad you came by tonight. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully reimagined and set in England to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.